Session 8. Language Development. Introduction. Language has been said to be man's finest asset. A branch of psychology, psycholinguistics, studies language as an aspect of the behavior of individuals. In this study session, you explore the concept of language, which is human-specific. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to point out the characteristics of language, explain how language is developed in an individual, discuss the significance of language to human development, and analyze the relationship between language and thinking skills. Definitions and characteristics of language. Language is the means of communication which involves vocalized speech that embodies units of meanings, that is words, arranged according to certain rules, like grammar. Speech is language behavior. It has developed in the course of human activity, which involves material transformation of the surrounding world. Language is a system of signs that serves as a means of human communication and mental activities. Reflection. Man can appropriately be described as a talking ape, for it is the power of speech more than the absence of a shaggy coat, naked ape, that sets human beings apart from other primates. It is impossible to think of human culture or civilization in the absence of language. Many essentially human activities spring from these unique characteristics by which man becomes detached from his physical world. He can indulge in reverences and imaginings. Without the spoken or written words, there could be little or no transmission of knowledge from individual to individual or generation to generation. There are two basic requirements for speech to become language. Namely, it must be systematic and symbolic. We may regard language in a somewhat atomistic fashion by looking at it as a collection of words strung together in sentences, each word having a separate identity and meaning. This is a false conception of language. The words are brought together in special ways to give a highly systematic order from which we get a meaning. Similarly, there is no one meaning for each word in a sentence. The meaning we ascribe to a sentence can change from one context to another. Consider this newspaper headline: Senator Akpan's burial used for party talk. The reader would ask, is it disco party or political party talk? Altering the position of words in a sentence alters the sense of the sentence, although the same words are there. For example, the sun is shining is different from is the sun shining? Therefore, language is not a collection of random string together words. Rather, it is a systematic where certain orderings are accepted as having prescribed meanings. The raw materials of each language are the basic sounds. Sound A gives the character of the language, and sound B forms one method of distinguishing different languages. Phonemes. The term we use for the perceived basic sounds of a language, despite the fact that the latitude in pronunciation within a culture may vary, e.g., Ìsàlẹ̀ òsì, Òṣogbo in Yoruba. The English language uses 43 phonemes. Certain phonemes are specific to a language. Th, as the in the English language, has no equivalent phoneme in French. Therefore, the French pronounce it as Z. Yet another example, R, is not contained in Japanese. Some African languages contain a glottal click sound. GB in Yoruba is one example. The phonemes do not convey meaning. Morphemes. They are formed when you put phonetic utterance together. These are the smallest units of a language, having a grammatical purpose. They are not necessarily words as we know them. E.g., in the word plant, there are two phonemes, plan and S. Plan is a word, but S, which serves the useful grammatical function of converting it to its plural form, is not a word as such. Prefixes, suffixes, and word endings, which change from singular to plural or alter the tense, are therefore morphemes. Each morpheme has a particular function and the formation of a sentence. By combining these morphemes so that they obey rules required of knowledge in grammar. However, it is not enough to be able to combine morphemes in a certain order. The resulting sentence must make sense. This brings us to semantics, the combination of morphemes to make words and arranging them together to give meaning in a particular tongue. For example, in the sentence, the green toes fought on the oranges. The grammatical structure is correct, but the sentence is meaningless in many cultures. Development of speech and language. The development of auditory sensation and perception in children is one of great interest. Experimental studies have been carried out on children at various levels of development. Developmental stages of speech. 1. Reflexive vocalization. The first month, that is the neonatal stage, is characterized by nondescript sounds or speech, sounds that cannot be classed. Crying is the most frequent usefulness to get attention. Pleasure, smiles are also observed. Towards the end of this period, you can differentiate between discomfort and comfort sounds. 2. Babbling. After the 6th week to the 6th month, when contended, the child will utter repetitive strings of sound, playing with sounds. There seems to be satisfaction at producing, through repeated practice, these sounds. At this stage, the baby acquires skill in making sounds. Lalling. Repeat sounds from the environment. Between the 6th and the 8th month, the child joins his vocalized syllables into repetitive sequences, such as baba, mama. 4. Echolalia. At around 9 to the 10th month, the child starts to imitate sounds from the environment. He indicates recognition of an object by vocalization. He uses gestures as substitute for speech, outstretched hand to be picked up, and so on. 5. True speech. This appears around 12 to 6 months. A child intentionally and correctly uses a conventional sound pattern and anticipates a response. By about 1 year, many children speak 2 or 3 words. They can locate sounds well, know their names, enjoy nursery rhymes, and even try to sing. Children at this age enjoy picture books. There is a change from using few words and much babbling and jargon to the use of about a dozen intelligible words. The child can obey simple orders. At this stage, the child can now talk. He has acquired speech. The main is the qualitative difference between the means of communication of human beings and that in the animal world. Reflection. Prenatal stage. Whether a fetus hears or does not is still an open question. Many have concluded that fetuses respond to loud sound and that such responses can be conditioned. The auditory mechanism seems to be well developed structurally during later fetal life, but in general, the fetus is probably deaf to sounds of normal intensity before birth and during a short period immediately after birth. Strong sounds, however, especially those that can directly pass through the mechanical block, seem to be able to bring about auditory stimulation. A newly born infant is said to be deaf for the first 2 to 3 days, but sounds such as hand clapping could be heard from the 4th day. Learning to speak. Language development involves the task of 1. Pronouncing words so that they will be understood. This means developing control over the vocal mechanism. 2. Associating meanings with words. 3. Building a vocabulary of usable words for communication. And 4. Combining these words into sentences. Pronunciation. This comes partly from a trial and error process, but mainly from imitation of a model. Vowel sounds come earlier than consonants. Types. Mispronunciation is prominent, known as baby talk, e.g., Kai for kids, for biscuits, Fista for filter, etc. This occurs as a result of 1. Omissions of one or more syllables. 2. Substitution of letters, dolly, tolly. And 3. Interchanges of letters, kai, kits, biscuits. Associating meanings with words. The next developmental task is to learn that words are associated with objects, people, and activities. Words are labels, that is, they have meaning. If not, it will be parrot fashion. In the process of conditioning and reinforcement, the child learns to associate words with shapes, sizes, textures, uses, and even sounds. Vocabulary building. Next, the baby learns new words as he grows older and new meaning of old words. Growth of vocabulary is very drastic between the ages of 18 months to 6 years. Table. Growth of vocabulary, 18 months to 6 years. Age 1. The average size in words, 3 to 4. 1.5 years. The average size is 20. At 2 years, the average size is approximately 200. At age 3, the average size in words is approximately 800. At age 5, the average size in words is approximately 1,800. At age 6, the average size is approximately 2,400. Use of sentences. From around age 18 months, the child starts 1 to 2 word sentences. He or she starts using verbs later. Adjectives follow. When the child approaches age 2, more words creep in gradually. With pronouns, gestures are not abandoned. The child starts to talk volubly. At around age 5, speech usually involves lisping and stuttering. The child wants to get everything out, everything at once. A child comprehends the meanings of what others say more readily than he can put into words to express his own thoughts and feelings. Facial expression and warm voice of the speaker helps. Delayed speech development. Laying a good foundation for speech communication for the child is essential to the social development of the child. Causes of delayed speech vary. These are some of the following causes. 1. Poor social environment. A child needs to be talked to and encouraged to verbalize. 2. Lack of incentive to talk. 3. Inadequate or defective model. 4. Prolonged illness. 5. Deafness. And lastly, multiple birth. Tip: speech is a special form of communication between people through language to get across our thoughts. A child is a born speaker and is born into a world of speakers. He has innate capacities. We are born with vocal equipment and neural systems, which gives us the capacity to verbalize. The sequence is broadly the same in children everywhere. The ability to vocalize element speech sounds emerges primarily as the result of neuromuscular. However, the child learns to use language for communicating with others, for understanding the speech of others, and for thinking. This means that the process of language acquisition is strongly influenced by environmental conditions and learning. As the language skill of a child improves, his behavior becomes controlled and regulated by the words of others or by instruction he gives himself. At the outset, language functions primarily as a means of communication. Gradually, it becomes the most important mediator and regulator of behavior. Behavior that is learned with the use of language is acquired quickly, is highly stable, and generalizes widely. Language and thinking. It is impossible to speak of language without considering thinking skills. Psycholinguists have tried to answer some important questions concerning language-thinking relationship. Some of them are: 1. Do we need to have language in order to think, or vice versa? 2. Do language and thinking skills grow as separate entities, or are they interconnected from the outset? Some researchers have argued that thought is language. Thinking is manipulating words in the mind. These word thoughts are regarded as internal speech, which shows up in the subvocal movements of human speech organs. The motor action that accompanies reading or thinking declines gradually. However, deaf people do think without vocalizing. This means that thought can occur without the agency of a language system as we know it. However, some people might still argue that vocalization does not exhaust other features of language. The thinking done by a deaf man is in some language, even in the absence of vocalization. The role of language in intellectual development. Speech plays a very important role in human concept formation and intellectual development. Piaget, 1963, introduced the notions of egocentric and socialized speech in preschool children. Egocentric speech. At the early stage, the child makes no attempt to adapt speech to the needs of the listener. There is no attempt to communicate. Properties of the young child's speech: the faulty use of pronouns and demonstrative adjectives, the incorrect ordering of events, the poor expression of causality, the tendency to omit important features, and finally, juxtaposition, are all concrete manifestations of the child's egocentrism in speech. That is, his inability to take the other person's point of view. With development, these egocentric manifestations decrease and speech becomes more socialized. The speaker becomes aware of the views of others and adapts his speech accordingly. Socialized speech. Egocentric speech disappears around 7 years. Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist, argued that egocentric speech went underground and became inner speech. At around 4 or 5 years, the child begins to use internal speech to control and organize his activities. The child thinks words instead of pronouncing. Language mediates between external events and the child's response. With an internal linguistic system, the child can represent external events, delay responding to them, and thereby can control his behavior. Therefore, it is a major factor in the growth of mental structures and concept formation of the child. Socialized speech has the following characteristics. 1. Adapted information involving an exchange of thoughts or ideas. 2. Criticism of the behavior or work of others. 3. Commands, requests, and threats. 4. Questions. And 5. Answers. The child speaks to communicate his thoughts to other people using socialized speech. Linguistic relatively hypothesis. It is often assumed that language is designed to express thoughts and that the structure of language must therefore reflect the structure of thought. Wolff, 1956, argued that it is possible that the relationship between language and thought is the other way around. Rather than thought limiting language, it may be that language limits thought. The argument is that the kinds of concepts and perceptions we have are affected by the particular languages we speak. People who speak very different languages perceive the world in very different ways. In other words, thought is relative to the language used to convey it. Language molds the way we think. The hypothesis cited linguistic evidence based on vocabulary differences. For example, the English language has only one word for snow, while the Eskimo has 4. This means that English speakers cannot perceive as many differences in the meaning of snow as Eskimo speakers. Likewise, the Garo language in Burma has different words for various kinds of rice and conditions of rice: husks and unhooked, cooked, etc. It can be said that Garo speakers perceive rice better as their language forces them to make subtle distinctions that go unnoticed in English. However, some of the phrases can be cumbersome. Recent critics of the hypothesis have shown that language embodies distinctions that are important to a culture. It is not language that creates those distinctions. Language does not even limit its speakers to those distinctions. In fact, language depends on the changes in the culture and not the other way around. Another example is the explanation of cultural variations in color terms. Striking commonalities were observed in basic color terms across language. For one, every language takes its basic color terms from a restricted set of 10 to 11 names. These are black, white, red, yellow, green, blue, brown, purple, pink, gray, and orange. No language has less than 2, black and white. It has been shown that perception of color variations are identical, though vocabularies differ. However, the linguistic relativity hypothesis cannot be dismissed too quickly. It calls our attention to one important point. When one has to learn to make fine discriminations in a particular field, it is helpful to have a vocabulary that expresses these discriminations. When we gain expertise in a field, we enlarge our vocabulary for distinctions in that field. That is, the jargons help us to think about and communicate these distinctions. Medicine cannot be practiced without a specialized vocabulary for anatomical parts. It is true that a distinction must exist in someone's mind before a term can be made up to embody it. Without the term, however, the distinction could not be easily talked about. The jargon of a particular field can often be annoying and sometimes pretentious. However, it plays an important cognitive role. Study session summary. In this study session, we have focused on the subject of language. We discussed the conceptions and basic muscle, the characteristics of language, the significance of language in human development, developmental stages of speech, and ultimately examine the theory of linguistic relativity. End of study session 8. Thank you for listening.